Hello, folks. It's Westy here, your director of theater with Glendon Performing Arts. And this month, our theme is musical theater. So, as Robin said in her video, we're going to be talking about Chicago. And while I'm talking about Chicago, I'm going to use it with you to explore an important idea in acting. The idea that we have to always make intentional choices while we're acting, and this is especially important in musical theater. You'll see what I mean if you watch the rest of this video. So to begin with, for this conversation, I need to give you a bit of history. You see, in Chicago, they talk often about the Vaudeville Circuit. So what is vaudeville, and what does this mean for how we have to act in a production of Chicago? Well, vaudeville, in North America at least, was popular from the mid-1890s until the early 1930s. Vaudeville shows consisted of 10 to 15 individual unrelated acts. There'd be magicians, acrobats, comedians, actors, singers, jugglers, dancers, trained animals. The equivalent over in the UK and much of Europe was often called music hall and variety. These variety shows were a sort of precursor to musical theater. They come from a lot of the same roots. Vaudeville finds its roots in 18th century France, where many troupes, well, they weren't allowed to perform legitimate drama pieces. All of the plays, those were only allowed to be performed by la comédie française. Everyone else, they legally weren't allowed. It's like copyright to the extreme. So instead, a lot of these acting troupes started to perform plays in pantomime, interpreting the action with, eventually, lyrics, choruses, songs set to popular tunes. This eventually developed into a form of musical theater, with spoken dialogue interspersed between the songs. It became very popular throughout Europe. In the US, and to a certain extent Canada, we had widely scattered urban centers. And this encouraged, instead of more cohesive shows like you would see in Europe, variety shows with a bunch of different acts, a bunch of different short pieces all put together, combining all sorts of different styles of performance. In the 1850s and 60s, more so just straight variety shows had a great popularity. These were often held in beer halls or taverns, places where people were drinking and getting drunk. And these shows were for a primarily male audience. They were coarse and sometimes even obscene. But then eventually these variety shows started turning into something else. The origins of vaudeville in North America are often credited to a man named Tony Pastor. He was a ballad and minstrel singer who was very inspired by things that were happening over in Europe. He's credited both with giving the first performance of what came to be called vaudeville and with making variety shows into something respectable. In 1881, he established a theater in New York City dedicated to having straight, clean variety shows. And with the success of this theater, many others began following suit, leading to the birth of the vaudeville circuits that we saw throughout North America. But why does that matter if we're putting on a show like Chicago? Sure, they mentioned vaudeville, it's good to know what it is, but why does it matter to us as actors? You see, vaudeville came with a very distinct style of performance, one that we often now just associate with the 1920s in general. The sort of thing you see with flapper girls and can-can dancers and those sorts of big numbers. In vaudeville, you only had 10 minutes to do your act. You had to make it count. You had to make an impression. And so things were huge, big, colorful, flashy, often being described as bombastic. And vaudeville, a lot of these acts trying to make an impression, they started to take inspiration from circus. I mean, as Billy Flynn says in Razzle Dazzle in Chicago, give them an act with lots of flash in it, and the reaction will be passionate. Vaudeville was all about that flash, making people react, making people pay attention to this act in particular, out of the 10 to 15 others they'd be seeing that night. Knowing these things can give a lot of context to how we act in a show, like Chicago. And the choices that we make based off of this knowledge can make or break a production. Obviously, the choices a director makes in staging a show make a wild difference. But within the director's broader vision, within the decisions being made by the director, are choices made by the actors on how we follow through with those directions. And this is an idea that I've started touching on in a few videos already. But all the choices we make must be intentional. Everything we do is communicating something. So we have to be aware of how our body's moving, what our face is doing, all of these things, and make sure that we're making intentional choices that communicate what we want to communicate about our characters, about their emotions, about the plot, about the themes, all of those things. And this is all the more important in musical theater. I know it is hard to learn your songs and learn the dances and still act on top of that. How you act, how you do your choreo, how you sing your songs are fundamental decisions that we have to make as actors for every show and every scene we're in. So let's use Chicago to pull up some examples of this. The choices that are made in the movie version of Chicago are really interesting. You see, Chicago has some really dark themes. It's literally about murder. The show is funny. Why? What does that? It's the choices that are being made. And a lot of the choices in the movie version of Chicago tie back to this idea of vaudeville and the vaudeville style of performance. Take the entirety of Mr. Cellophane, for example. Amos is there, dressing as a clown, singing his song on a literal stage. It is very much a vaudeville performance, an emotional performance, but a vaudeville performance. He's out there on stage doing his little jazz hands, looking out at an audience. It's very much a vaudeville show. And you see the same thing with They Both Reached for the Gun. A lot of vaudeville shows would have puppet acts. And so here we see this puppeteering. Everything is exaggerated, big, bombastic. They go from this serious press conference immediately into a wild song. And the choices that the actors make in how they do their choreo and how this scene is done play a very important role in the messaging of this scene coming across. In They Both Reached for the Gun, we see these two main actors, Richard Gere and Renee Zellweger, playing into this theme of control and performance, and how Billy Flynn, the lawyer, is controlling the actions and the words for Roxy Hart and how she comes off to the press. Clearly, the directorial choices in this scene are phenomenal, but the way the actors play it is incredibly important. We see a strong contrast in the body movement between the puppet version of Roxy and Billy Flynn, the smarmy, confident lawyer. He moves freely, whereas everything she does is very stiff and upright. It's very clear when you watch the scene, the acting choices that are being made. A song in Chicago that really embodies this vaudeville spirit is Razzle Dazzle. In the movie, it's literally a circus in the courtroom. So let's look a little bit closer at the choices that were made during that song. Obviously, again, incredible choices by the director, really taking advantage of the fact that this is a film with these splices between the circus and the real courtroom. But if we watch Richard Gere, he's doing some really incredible stuff here. his body language. There's this open confidence. His motions are big and dramatic, bringing that vaudeville grandiosity with these wide sweeping gestures. And even his small movements are quite flashy, but he's also always visibly calm and controlled. We can see through his choices that this is a master lawyer in his element. We can also see in his choices that Billy Flynn is a performer. This courtroom is a stage. It's a performance that he's doing here as a lawyer. And Richard Gere really brings that through in his acting. An example of the drama that's in even the smaller movements that Richard Gere does in this scene is when he holds up his fingers for the woman with the glasses who can't see. You see those sharp, controlled movements in his body language in general that says, hey, this man is in total control. There's also a strong contrast between Billy Flynn and the dancers around him that communicates a lot about his character. He's got that upwards, outwards confidence. There's almost a stiffness to how he moves, but it communicates that he's so very sure of himself. Look here when he does the same movements as the dancers. Not quite the same, but they're moving forward together. As the dancers move, there's a fluidity to their movement and a variety to their movement. Whereas everything Billy Flynn does is sharp and punctuated. Even if they were doing exactly the same choreo, Richard Gere is making intentional acting choices that communicate a lot. Then again, in the courtroom, when he's walking up to Amos, that stagger remains. And throughout the whole courtroom scene, his hand motions are large and exaggerated, even when they're not part of specifically assigned choreography. He carries those same sorts of motions through to the rest of his acting, the rest of his performance in this courtroom scene. Another very, very interesting thing, and I think an important thing about the way Richard Gere acts throughout this scene, is when you see little moments that aren't necessarily part of that outwards act that Billy Flynn is putting on for the jury. When he shakes his head as Amos leaves the witness stand, it's far more subtle. It's an almost inward movement, rather than the outward performance we've been seeing for the rest of the scene. Earlier, when the woman can't see his fingers, and he makes this face, it's part of the performance. The difference between the two faces. One is subtle and inwards. The other one is far less subtle. It's outwards. It's part of this performance. Richard Gere is communicating through his performance as Billy Flynn that Billy Flynn is putting on a performance. There's layers here, and it comes from the choices that Gere makes as an actor. As we see with Billy Flynn in this number, every little thing says something. From the smallest facial expressions to the way he moves, both with and without choreo, Richard Gere is showing Billy Flynn's character. He is showing us why he will win this case, and leaving no room to doubt that utter confidence. Everything he does oozes this calm, controlled confidence. And a little bit condescending or patronizing in there too. It's got that vaudeville flair in a calm, controlled manner, which says so much about Billy Flynn as a character. Though, of course, this is not the only way to interpret the lawyer Billy Flynn. Some productions of Chicago might play more into the greasy, smarmy side of this lawyer, showing how truly condescending he is, and that at times he can even be a bit of a creep. Rather than a calm, confident showman smile like Richard Gere gives us, Billy Flynn could be doing something more almost sinister. Just a difference in a smile could communicate something so fundamentally different about the character. Even if two actors play the exact same character and say the exact same lines, it's going to be different. And that comes from the choices that they are making as actors, which is why it's so important, especially when we're doing musical theater, to consider everything we do and make sure that we're consciously making intentional choices. Go back and look at the choreo video from Robin. As you practice the dance for Razzle Dazzle that we've given you in our last video, consider how you're moving and what faces you're making. Every little bit will say something about the character you're portraying, whether we as actors want it to or not. So make the choices intentional. When you're doing hand movements, you can play into making it vaudeville, showy, flashy. Or you could make it something a little more subtle. There are so many different ways you can wiggle your fingers or take your steps. So play with it and see what it might say about the character. Because when we're doing the exact same choreo, hand motion, little hips, bringing your hands up, there's so many very subtle differences that can say so many very different things. So consider it and make your choices intentional. Whenever you're in a show, but especially when you're in a musical where you have to sing and dance, you have to figure out not how you would do everything you need to do, but how your character would. When you're learning the choreo, when you're singing your songs, you aren't singing and dancing as yourself. You're singing and dancing as your character. Take direction from the director. They have ideas, they have a vision, but they don't have the time to do the work for you. So, when you're learning your parts, when you're working on things, think about it. Make your choices, and then play into them. You don't necessarily have to go through things movement by movement and line by line and think deeply about everything. You can think about it more generally and then turn that into a conscious choice to play that character that way always. An exercise that I've done to a certain extent with you all before and often happens in drama classes and things like that is getting up and walking around, embodying different characteristics. Whenever you get a new character that you have to play, I highly encourage you to walk around a room. Pay attention to how you walk. And then switch and walk how your character would walk. Figure out what part of the body they would lead with. Figure out how quickly they take their steps, how they move their arms as they're walking. It will be different from yourself. Note those differences. Note why your character walks this way. Once you understand something as simple as how your character moves when they're walking, it will help you so much to carry those differences and carry those choices into what you're doing in every other aspect of playing that character. I guarantee you, when Richard Gere was figuring out how to play Billy Flynn, he spent at least a little while walking around in circles, doing silly little gestures with his hands, trying to figure out how to embody that character. And once he figured it out, he was able to apply it across all of the scenes in the movie to be consistent and to communicate intentionally through everything he was doing. Aspects of the character, the plot, and the themes of the musical. It's so important as actors to make sure that we're making choices for our characters, making choices in how we represent our characters, because so much can be said in even the smallest things. even when we're doing a style that's as big and flashy as something inspired by vaudeville, the subtlest differences really count. Thank you so much for watching the video today. I hope you enjoyed. I do encourage you to go try out the choreo after listening to some of the things that I had to say. Coming up next week, Zach will be teaching you one of these songs from Chicago as well. And when it comes to that, remember these same decisions that need to be made for dancing and acting, and they need to be made for how you're singing as well. Your tone of voice, the faces you're making, all of those things. Anyways, I do hope you enjoyed watching today. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much. We'll have a live session at the end of the month. Hope to see you all there. Bye.